right. We are official. We are live. It is 12:01 on this lovely Friday here coming at you in Humboldt County, McKinleyville, California. My name is Virgil Moorhead Jr. I'm the Behavioral Health Director here at Two Feathers Native American Family Services, which is located right here in McKinleyville. I want to, before I introduce our wonderful guest and my colleague, Chris Shaw, I want to pay honor and respect to the land that I'm currently on, which is the land of the Wiyot people. And I want to also pay honor and respect and let the audience know who's tuning in that Two Feathers stands in solidarity with those that are working for social justice and equity issues in our country. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Mr. Chris Shaw, who's been on here before, but just to say what's up, Chris.
Hello, everybody. I'm back. I have my shoes behind me now, and I have my comic book with me, so I'm ready to go, and I'm ready to have this talk.
Thank you, Chris. And with that, I want to introduce our guest today, who is Dr. Joanna Williams. Dr. Williams is a PhD. She's associate professor in the Graduate School of Applied and Professional Psychology at Rutgers University. She's making that transition from to Rutgers from the University of Virginia. She serves as a faculty affiliate with the Youth Next University of Virginia Center to promote effective youth development. A big core part of her work is the study around race and ethnicity as a social context for youth development. She serves on numerous boards and committees and is really a thought leader around adolescent youth development, race and culture and ethnic issues. How I found her and thought that she would be a great fit for our speaker series was through the University of Virginia's Next Gen Center in their conferences, which is really great. And they have videos on there. And so she's really, I think, fit very much in line with our speaker series. And so welcome, Dr. Williams.
Thank you so much for having me.
And so how today's conversation is going to go is Dr. Williams is going to share some of her work. And then after that, we'll have a conversation. For those of you that are tuning in on Facebook, feel free to make comments, ask questions, and we'll try our best to get to them. And so I think you should be good to share your screen, Dr. Williams.
Sure. Give me a moment. All right, can you see that?
Yes.
Good. Well, thank you so much for having me. It's really an honor to be here virtually. I am joining the conversation from my 8-year-old daughter's bedroom, hence the purple walls. We are actually still in Charlottesville, Virginia. I'm wrapping up my time at UVA. Although I will still, as you heard, maintain my affiliations. I've been here for 12 years and I'm excited to join the faculty at Rutgers and also head back to my home state of New Jersey, which we'll do later this summer. So I'm a developmental psychologist by training with a focus on adolescent development. Just as sort of a positioning of myself, I have a strong belief in positive youth development, which is the idea that all young people possess strengths and have the capacity to thrive. And really what they need are supportive contexts in order to do that. I think adolescence is a period which, young people are poised to learn things really quickly. They're really good at experimenting and trying new things and, problem solving in really out of the box sort of ways. And again, we just need to provide them with the conditions to do that effectively. I also, as you heard, have a central interest in thinking about ethnicity and race as context for youth development. So for me, that means we all develop in the context of the of at least the United States, we're in a racialized society. And so race and ethnicity operate at multiple levels. Today, I'll talk about identity, which is really this kind of psychological processes of developing a sense of who you are in relation to your ethnic or racial group. But we can also think about race operating at institutional and systemic levels as well. So with that, today I'm going to focus on ethnic and racial identity, and I figured it would be helpful to begin with kind of an orientation to what that construct is and how it's commonly studied in the context of developmental science. So let's see. We'll just start with kind of a common definition in my field of what ethnic and racial identity is. A few years ago now, so back in 2014, there were a group of scholars that came together, and they'd really tried to make some integrated sense of the then growing literature on ethnic and racial identity. And so they pulled from lots of different studies about lots of different youth, and they came up with this integrated definition. So we define ethnic racial identity as a multidimensional psychological construct that reflects the beliefs and attitudes that individuals have about their ethnic racial group membership, as well as the processes by which these beliefs and attitudes develop over time. So it's multidimensional. There's content, which are personal beliefs and attitudes, and then there's a process of development. Ethnic racial identity is an interaction between maturation or kind of individual development and context. And therefore it takes different forms and has different meanings across the lifespan. So if we're talking about, a young child, the way that we understand or that they might understand their ethnicity or race looks very different from an adolescent or an adult. When we think about adolescence in kind of numerous studies of the development of ethnic and racial identity among young people, there tends to be an increasing sense of connection to one's ethnic or racial group and an increasing sense of pride over time. There's more variance in the dimension of exploration, so how much young people actively spend kind of finding out more about their ethnic group. There's a lot of individual variation across young people. And in general, most of the research on ethnic and racial identity has been among youth of color. And there's evidence that seeing oneself through the lens of ethnicity and race tends to be more salient for young people of color as well. One of the reasons that this is the case has to do with, again, the kind of context in which we develop and the way that different groups are racialized. So Beverly Tatum, who's a psychologist who wrote a book called Why Are All the Black Kids Sitting Together in the Cafeteria, says, why do many Black youth in particular think about themselves in terms of race? Because that is how the rest of the world thinks of them. Our self-perceptions are shaped by the messages that we receive from those around us. And when young Black men and women enter adolescence, the racial content of those messages intensifies. So depending on the racial category that you identify with or that others identify you with, that may change the way that race or ethnicity play a role in your developing identity. Black youth, as well as Native American youth, often tend to be racialized in particular ways. And so that makes ethnic and racial identity potentially more salient for them. Okay, so I'm going to spend a few minutes talking about models of ethnic and racial identity. These mostly come from the psychological literature. And I'll talk about the models because when I talk about the research on outcomes for youth development, some of the models and the terms are connected to one another. So it's important that we have some shared language to draw from. I would say one of the most common models that describes ethnic racial identity development was developed by a woman named Jean Finney, who's also a scholar. And she talked about a process that was very much influenced by Erik Erikson, who is known for kind of these grand theories of how humans develop over time. And he focused a lot on identity development. And essentially, Finney, as well as others who've got similar models, suggest that we begin in a state of kind of unexamined ethnic identity where, there's very little awareness of our ethnic or racial group membership. We might rely on what other people tell us that our label is and, what that means without thinking about it. And it may be that there's no dissonance in our everyday experiences that would prompt us to actually do some thinking about this part of our identity. Um, as young people grow and they develop some kind of cognitive maturity, there may be either related to cognitive development or related to specific experiences, processes that kind of catalyze deeper thinking about one's ethnic or racial identity. So this is called the search process. It can result from a negative experience, so being called a racial or ethnic slur, for example. It could be due to changing context, so moving, say, into a middle school with a different racial or ethnic composition than an elementary school. Any of those things can increase one's awareness and sort of push a young person into this exploration and search process. Sometimes what we see if we're looking at kids in schools, and this is something that I've spent some time looking at, is when we're talking about racially and ethnically diverse schools, you'll start to see young people around middle school spend time with other kids that are from similar racial or ethnic groups as part of the identity exploration and search process. As we move through that process, Finney talked about reaching an achieved sense of identity where you have a clear and confident sense of yourself. At this stage, we see more kind of cross-group interactions because you have a stable sense of who you are, and there's no sort of threats of that being compromised if you move into out-group relationships. Related to Finney's developmental process model and very much influenced by Erik Erikson and another psychologist named James Marcia, she described 4 statuses that we might have in terms of our ethnic identity. And, these can change over time, but they're based on this matrix where we can have levels of exploration, which can be low or high, and levels of kind of commitment to your group, which can be low or high. So you can see in the top left quadrant, high commitment and low exploration is considered a foreclosed identity, where you feel like, I know what my group is, but then you've never done any sort of reflection on thinking about what that membership means to you. And that can provide a lot of stability, although it can also create some defensiveness if you're ever sort of challenged on what your membership means to you. That's contrasted with somebody who's in a diffuse state where they don't feel a strong sense of connection to an ethnic or racial or a cultural group, and they haven't explored it at all. The active search process with, not yet a commitment, but lots of exploration is described as moratorium. And then that achieved status that I mentioned before is reflected in high levels of commitment and high levels of exploration. So that's one model. And I would say a lot of the research findings that I'll present later are based in Finney's model. There's a measure of ethnic identity called the multi-group ethnic identity measure that has commonly been used in developmental psychology to quantitatively assess where young people are in terms of their ethnic identity development. It's a model that was developed in, I'll say generic and not in a negative way, but in the sense that it's meant to be relevant to young people from any racial or ethnic group. And it wasn't developed with one particular group in mind. That's contrasted with this next model, the multidimensional model of racial identity, which was proposed by Rob Sellers, who actually used to be here at University of Virginia. He's now a provost at University of Michigan. And essentially in his framework, rather than trying to capture the process of development over time, he was more interested in kind of the key components of what it means to have a racial identity. And this model was developed specifically with a focus on African Americans. So the dimensions that are listed here include centrality, or how important your race is to you. And I think a sort of important note to make is that, regardless of your racial background, race may not be a sort of central and defining feature in your identity. So I say that now because I'm focusing on ethnic and racial identity, but for many people, including African Americans, it may not be the central way in which they define themselves. And so this model recognizes that we can vary in our centrality. Racial group regard is your sense of how you view your group, whether you think you have positive regard for your group or negative regard. And then it's also about how you think other people view your group. Does society view your group, through a negative or positive lens? Salience has to do with how you're thinking about your race in a particular moment. And this can change as you move throughout your day. So I imagine many of us have had the experience where we walk into a room and, something about that situation makes us suddenly very aware of our race or our racial identity. So salience is kind of in the moment awareness. And then finally, ideology is about different sort of belief systems related to, in this case, being African American. Sellers and colleagues recognize that there's not one kind of monolithic way to think about what it means to be Black, but instead there may be different ideologies that people hold. So for example, some people may have a very Afrocentric ideology. Others may have a nationalistic view or an assimilationist view, and all of those are valid, and they need to be considered in how we understand racial identity. I will say, when I talk about the research, there's a measure that goes along with this model, and it's been frequently used, not just with the Black community, but also with other racial and ethnic communities. Ideology is not as well studied in the literature, so I don't think we can draw many conclusions related to it, but there is a good bit of research on centrality and regard, and I'll talk about that in a few minutes. Okay. The last model that I want to share is one that I think is relevant potentially to the audience. It's a model that was developed by Carol Markstrom to think specifically about, as you see in the title, identity formation of American Indian adolescents, local, national, and global considerations. And so what Carol Markstrom tried to do in her model was think about the complex ways in which identity sort of takes shape. And so one of those levels is the level of the kind of local, so individuals within, say, family context, for example. And that's where ethnic identity emerges. She identified dynamics of the sort of local ethnic identity, including things like identification, as you see in the slide, with potentially a clan or a tribe, your own self-identification. Identification may include things like blood quantum. Connection is another dynamic of one's ethnic identity, which again is connection to kin or clan or tribe, to your ancestral heritage, perhaps connection to land or place. And then she also named culture and spirituality as an important dimension of sort of local ethnic identity, which can be reflected in language, origin stories, worldviews, beliefs and practices, and so on. And as you can see on the bottom, sources of influence include things like family and kin, and the other things that you're exposed to in your immediate day-to-day context. So already you can see this model kind of goes a little bit beyond some of the other models, which distill down to these generalizable features. And it talks about the complex contributors. There's more to the model, as I'll show you in the next slide. So she also identified ways in which Native American youth identity may operate in terms of one's position in a national context as well as a global context. And so for each of those, you can see she identified different types of identity that might emerge. So nationally, you might think about some elements of biculturalism if you feel like you have to kind of sort of navigate between your own local culture and kind of the dominant culture around you. At the global level, things like indigenous movements bring people together globally. There may also be hybrid identities based on global exposure that's made more accessible through things like media and internet, for example. So it's a complex model and one that I wanted to share as a resource, but it's also one where there isn't a lot of empirical research associated with it since the model's been developed. Okay, so those are some models, and you'll hear some of that terminology again in a few minutes. I want to briefly make a mention of context, and I think Carol Markstrom identifies context very specifically in her model. Beverly Tatum, who I mentioned earlier from her book, Why Are All the Black Kids Sitting Together in the Cafeteria, says, when speaking of identity, the answer to the question, who am I, depends in large part on who the world around me says I am. Who do my parents say I am? What message is reflected back to me in the faces and voices of my teachers, my neighbors, store clerks? What do I learn from the media about myself? How am I represented in the cultural images around me? Or am I missing from the picture altogether? So identities are not developed in a vacuum. we are influenced by, the experiences that we have in our day-to-day context, again, at the very local, immediate, and proximal level, as well as also at these more distal levels. Carol Markstrom, again, identifies explicitly these kinds of contextual influences that may contribute to a sense of local, national, or global identity. And then one that I wanted to pay a little bit of attention to just briefly is the family context. So again, in developmental science, there's been a growing bit of research on processes of ethnic and racial socialization that occur in families. A lot of the research has been done, at least the early research was done mostly in African-American families, although it's expanded over the years. I think it's important to think about families as sort of sources of funds of knowledge. So all of the resources that you need to understand who you are as it relates to your ethnic or racial group are shaped in large part by your family dynamics. So the next couple of slides will identify the kinds of messages that have been documented in the research on ethnic and racial socialization in families. So they include things like cultural socialization, which are messages that promote pride and transmit knowledge about cultural history and heritage. Preparation for bias. These are messages intended to prepare children to adapt to and operate within a racialized world, including exposure to prejudice and discrimination. So many people are familiar with the concept in Black families of the talk that parents may have to have with their growing children who are moving into adolescence about what to do if you are encountering the police, for example. So preparation for bias would be, that kind of conversation. Egalitarianism is a message that conveys sort of an emphasis on diversity and racial equality. Promotion of mistrust occurs in some families, which are sort of cautions and warnings to children about other ethnic groups. In some of the literature, in terms of like the benefits of these messages, that one is not necessarily promotive of kind of well-being for young people, but it is something that young people may talk about happening in their families, or that parents and other caregivers share that they convey to their children. So there's 4. I'm going to mention a few more that have taken on a little bit more prominence in some of the more recent work on school racial socialization, which has become an increasing interest of mine. And these messages could come in families as well. So Christy Bird is a scholar who's been studying school racial socialization, and she drew from the family racial social literature to identify like what are the messages that schools are communicating to children about race. So in addition to the ones I just named, color blindness is a common one, so messages that deny the relevance of race in society and identity. Silence is common in school settings and in families, although perhaps we're in a moment where, people are learning the dangers of staying silent about race and racism. And then critical consciousness are messages that teach youth to recognize and address differences between racial groups in power and privilege. And that's more, related to kind of a social justice perspective. So there's some evidence of that in families, and there's been sort of increasing literature to see how schools may be emphasizing that message too. But all of these things, as you can imagine, can influence a young person as they're developing their ethnic and racial identity. So I think they're important to name. Okay, so moving on to outcomes. When I provided the definition of ethnic and racial identity up front, I drew from work that was published in 2014 by a group of scholars. I think they were called the 21st Century Ethnic and Racial Identity Study Group. And they did a lot of really great hard work looking across years and years of research on ethnic and racial identity. And I think what they found in general is really positive. So one of my take-home messages is that having a strong sense of yourself as a member of an ethnic or racial group, particularly a member of a minoritized ethnic or racial group, is positive. So it tends to be positively related to psychological well-being, academic outcomes, physical health, and behavioral health as well. So specifically on this slide, I've named a few of the dimensions and just listed the kinds of positive outcomes that they're associated with. Now, some of the caveats to this is that there's more research on some racialized groups than others. So a lot of the research on racial identity has been done on with African American youth. A lot of the research on ethnic identity has been done with youth who identify with Latinx communities or Asian American communities. I would say there's less research in general on Native American youth, although in this particular paper that I've cited here, they are able to document some research that does exist, although it's a smaller. So there's kind of a disproportionate representation of different racialized groups in the research, but still across groups, these consistent positive findings emerge. So I'm not going to read all of them, but you can see them there. In my own work, I have spent a bit of time studying ethnic and racial identity as sort of a developmental process. In the early years, I was doing research on young adolescents who were mostly Black or Latinx youth who had been involved in the juvenile or adult criminal justice systems and understanding ethnic identity as it related to perceptions of the legal system and to police. Following that work, I was pushing the field to think about ethnic and racial identity as a central process. So perhaps now we understand maybe why this is important. But back just a few years ago, I would say research on ethnic and racial identity was very much siloed in developmental science. It was sort of like this special side topic that only a few of us seem to care about. And so there's been a push to think about it as a core aspect of youth development that should be more prominent in our research. Just like we study, how youth learn or, their cognitive development, ethnic and racial identity is this core developmental process. In my own work, I found evidence that it has protective effects. So it can buffer youth from discrimination and family stress, particularly the dimensions that focus on kind of group connection and pride. Those tend to be consistently related to buffering against the negative effects of discrimination. Sometimes higher levels of exploration can make young people more attuned to the potential for discrimination, and that can kind of exacerbate some negative symptoms, but it's balanced by a sense of pride and group connection, which can offset those negative outcomes. And then finally, I said in the beginning that I really think of myself as somebody who sees adolescence through the lens of positive youth development. As I was introduced to formal models of positive youth development, there's this 5 C's model by Rich Lerner, who's at Tufts University. The C's are competence, confidence, character, connection, and caring as sort of the key ingredients that young people need in order to thrive. And I think all of those are really valuable, but when I sort of was reading all the literature on that model, there was a lack of attention, in my opinion, to the context of race and ethnicity and thinking about ethnic and racial identity. So in some of my other work, I've looked at ethnic and racial identity as an essential part of positive youth development that we need to consider when we're understanding how youth thrive. Okay, so the last thing that I want to talk about are some implications for schools. Increasingly, I've moved away from, just looking at sort of large scale surveys to actually going in and, doing more interview and mixed methods research with young people in schools, in middle schools in particular. So as young people are making meaning of their ethnic and racial identity, they're doing so in the context of curriculum and instruction, peer interactions, and a broader racial climate. Recently, one of my former students and I published a paper based on some interviews that we did in students in local middle schools here in Central Virginia. And one of the points we make in the introduction to the paper is that history in schools, which came up a lot in our interviews with kids when we asked them what they learned about race, tends to be taught through a Eurocentric frame that perpetuates this master script or this master narrative. It obscures and erases the knowledge and experiences of African Americans as well as Indigenous people. And essentially it leaves you with these really sort of shallow one-dimensional narratives about racial groups and their experiences in the United States. And we saw that coming up in our interviews. So in the next few slides, there's some quotes that we have from students. These are all pseudonyms. Desiree, this was an interview we did with her when she was in 6th grade. And the question, I think I was doing this interview, was, what does being Black mean to you? Or how did you learn about, what it means? And she says, like, when I was little, I already knew I was Black, but I didn't really know the meaning. But at school, like when we started talking about slaves and all that, that's what I really learned it from. But they never really talked about what Black people did. They just talked about how they were slaves, as one example. Similarly, Andre, who's also Black, and this was his 6th grade interview, had said he identified as African American, and Kristen asks him, so what does the term African American mean to you? He says, I'm Black. So what does that mean to you? I guess race. It's a race. All right. So how do you learn about that term? And he says, in a class called history. And so she asked, so what did you talk about in history? And he says, slavery. And that was sort of, this is the context of the knowledge that I have in understanding to me what it means to be Black. Jasmine, who's a Black and white biracial student, was telling me that she learned the main point of history is about segregation between Black and white. That was sort of her big take-home message as a 7th grader. And then in my interview with Stephanie, she was telling me about what she learned, again, in the context of history. And she said, there should be information about other races. We're just underrated because it's always about white people and like war. Now we're learning about World War II. And that had a little bit of information about Asians, but that was just showing their bad side. And you never get to see like what their culture is or any of that. We, Latinos, only come into news when it's about immigration. And then I asked her, what do you feel you've learned about people who are white or European American? And you can see here, she says that they're more superior to us. And she says, they get to seem like they've only done, like they don't do anything bad, but we've all done some good and some bad. Okay, so I'm just about to wrap up. And before I get to kind of some concluding points, I want to let everybody know that it doesn't have to be this way. So the students in the schools where we were doing our interviews all sort of very consistently talked about history as the place where they learned about race. And they shared these very sort of shallow and one-dimensional frames of knowledge that they were being exposed to. But there are places that are doing, a lot deeper, better work. So school districts that have adopted culturally relevant curricula, including Tucson Unified School District or ethnic studies in San Francisco. Not only are students talking about like the development of their identity, but there's also benefits for academic outcomes. So with the Mexican American Studies program in Tucson, students who were enrolled had an increased likelihood of passing the state standardized test and graduating from high school. One of my favorite documentaries is called Precious Knowledge, where you see actually youth talking about their experiences there and how they fought back when the program was being banned. And in San Francisco, taking ethnic studies for 9th graders was related to increased attendance, grade point average, and credits earned. Specifically related to identity, Adriana Umania-Taylor developed something called the Identity Project, which is an 8-week school-based curriculum that currently they show evidence that it's related to increases in students' ethnic identity exploration and resolution. So you can actually manipulate it if you invest time in helping students understand what it means. All right, so as my final thoughts, as I mentioned a few times, ethnic and racial identity is a central developmental process. It promotes important psychosocial, behavioral, and academic benefits, particularly for youth of color. As a psychological construct, a young person's ethnic racial identity shapes how they appraise their experiences and inputs from others, and in turn, it then influences their behavior. Schools have an opportunity to actively support young people's ethnic racial identity development through formal curricula and intentional creation of affirming spaces. And I think, as you heard, we need to be doing a lot more of that. In the absence of kind of formal knowledge that provides some depth and nuance to, what race is and what it means to be, members of particular racialized groups, then students draw their own conclusions. And as we find in our current research, a lot of times that leads to othering and sort of misconceptions about, how race is operating in their day-to-day lives. All right, I think that is where I'm going to end. Thank you so much for listening, and I look forward to discussing more.
Thank you so much. That was awesome. Chris has got the first question.
Well, I have so many questions, but I'm going to start off the first one by kind of telling a little about myself. So I am Black and I'm Native, and I found myself with a lot of identity problems kind of growing up and trying to figure out who I was. because I found myself trying to be Black and Native in a society that wanted to be either, but they wanted to be either of them. So how important is it in the models to actually find that racial identity or find out who you are before you're able to have that success? Because I know for me personally, I wasn't able to do what I wanted to do or be who I wanted to be until I figured out, or until I took that step and figured out who I wanted to be, who I was as an Indigenous and Black person.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that part of your story. I think, well, I'll answer this in a couple of ways. If we're just focusing on ethnic and racial identity, the sort of science says that if you have a more like integrated and whole sense of yourself, like if you're able to make a meaning of it that feels right to you and it feels like it fits in with who you are, then that's going to be beneficial. It's going to be beneficial for, you know, other things like academic functioning and behavior, mental health, and all of those things. At the same time, there's other literature on other aspects of identity. So, you know, we know that identities are, I only talked about ethnic and racial, but we've got intersectional identities and multiple ways of defining ourselves. I think on one hand, what's really important is having a sense of connection and an integrated sense of like, you know, I feel really strongly about this aspect of my identity. And that may be something like sexuality or gender or religion. It doesn't necessarily have to be ethnicity or race. It could be, you know, related to like a particular talent that you have. So feeling a strong connection to some aspect of identity is really important for well-being. But members of racial and ethnic minoritized groups, it's almost difficult to like escape the fact, you know, it may not be salient to you, but it's often made salient to you by others. And the experience you're talking about is a common one that often, again, in middle schools, when kids are starting to notice and there's all of the like, you know, social positioning of like who's got status and who doesn't and what group you're going to be in and what group you're not going to be in. I think when kids don't have any support for like racial literacy or how to make sense of all of that, it becomes a lot more challenging than it needs to be. We found in doing our interviews that some kids were like, oh, like I actually get to talk about this. And they were like, we never get to talk about stuff like this. So it was like a sense of relief to be able to share some of the experiences they were having because they were spending so much time drawing these conclusions on their own and not realizing like that their peers were having similar experiences. So I think the challenge that you talked about is one that can be common, and it's often made worse by the fact that we don't create spaces for kids to do this exploration and like do it together so they realize they're all learning.
Yeah, I know when I was in that age, it was a lot of me hearing that I'm not Black enough, or I'm not Native enough, I'm not this, I'm not that. So I feel like if I would have been in that situation, been able to talk more about it, it would have helped me a lot trying to figure out who I was because I was so lost. But I know that having that one part of identity that you connect with is very, very important. And also that having that family dynamic with your identity is also really important. So thank you for that.
Yeah, thank you.
So I'm thinking as a follow-up to Chris's question, you know, we were just in our clinical supervision earlier this morning at Two Feathers, the therapist, the psychotherapist. And one of the things that we were talking about was what about those youth that, you know, maybe they're really, you know, live on the reservation, they're part of the Native community, but they're like, it's not important to me. And so, you know, and so what I was saying is like, we don't want to like force them to start talking and exploring that if they don't want to. And what I took from what you're saying is, but maybe it's being flexible around all the different identities and looking at what's important to them and helping them sort of develop more understanding and more competence and more strength in that identity, whether it's gender, sexual orientation, or some talent. Is that kind of what you're saying?
Yeah, absolutely. And there's research showing that. So there was some work by Andrew Fellini, who's at UCLA, and Lisa Kang, who's down at Wake Forest, who they were looking at ethnic identity and well-being among a very diverse sample of young people. And they thought they would find like everybody who was in the achieved status was doing well. What they found was like that stronger sense of ethnic identity was really helpful in the face of discrimination. So it helped to buffer against the negative effects of discrimination. But in terms of overall well-being, all of the young people were doing well if they had some sense of connection to, they measured, I think, ethnic identity, family identity, kind of a national American identity, and maybe religious identity. As long as there was at least one strong area where a young person felt, this is who I am, then they were doing pretty well. It was those youth who didn't feel connected to any of those groups who were not doing as well. I also remember a story of having students here at the university. They were African-American female twins, and I was teaching a course on adolescence. And I made this point that, like, just because you're Black doesn't mean it's salient to you. And they like pulled me aside after class and they were like, thank you for saying that, because for us, it's never been all of that salient. It's how we define, they were identical twins. So that was like a huge part of their identity. But they felt like everybody assumed that because they, were received as Black, that must be, the most central defining feature. So it was for them a sense of relief. Like, it doesn't have to be the one thing that is like my defining characteristic.
As a follow-up to that, what's coming up for me is, in all your work around positive youth development or just adolescence and research, is there like screenings or assessment strategies, tools that can help with, whether it's a clinician or whether it's a mentor, be able to better understand those salient identities, like training, or what are your thoughts around how we can better interpret in the youth work that we're doing, which identities are salient?
Yeah, so I don't have a formal clinical scale and I don't want to overstep my knowledge area, but I will say that there are some, pretty straightforward measures that I've used in, survey measures that ask, like, how important are each of these, sort of social identity categories to you? And so young people there's just a list of things that are, related to gender, sexuality, race, ethnicity, culture, and, maybe like 10 or so, including individual talents as one. And you can just ask people to, like, maybe even if it's in a conversational setting, tell me about which of these are most important to you. There is some evidence in schools that, these, in social psychology, these like affirmation exercises that you can do with young people help to diffuse some of the stereotypes that exist about group membership. And usually those exercises just ask young people to name, in this case, the values that they find the most important. But you could do the same thing. Like, tell me about, here's a list of these identities. Tell me about which ones are most important to you and why. I think that would help get at, what they find most central.
That makes sense. I guess before I throw it over to Chris and take some questions from the audience, I guess I was wondering also, in looking at your PowerPoint before and then listening to you, where the work of the trauma-informed movement in the schools, and what are your thoughts about the strengths or maybe the weaknesses? Because we're using like the positive youth development framework, and what I took from you was there's a critique of that in the sense of racial ethnic identity, and we need to not just have that as a variable, but it's deeply embedded into, our identities and who we become as adults from adolescence. I'm wondering your thoughts about the trauma informed movement, and how familiar you are, or where you feel racial ethnic identity come into play with the trauma informed movement, because we do a lot of work in the schools, and that's a big movement over the last like 5 to 10 years.
Yeah, it's definitely something that I hear about in my conversations with educators, local educators. I think that it is like there's important intersections. And I often hear, I would say in the past 3 years, cultural relevance and trauma informed go hand in hand. And in some ways there's a connection, but I think part of it is about, educators doing some deep reflection about their positionality and understanding, how their own views were developed and how that positions them in relation to their students. I think on the trauma informed side, there's probably this careful balance that we need to strike, because I think collective historical trauma is real. And so when we think about collective and historical trauma that's been inflicted upon groups, that's something that we see the legacies of. But I'm not sure that we would always see the legacies of sort of historical trauma manifesting in an individual young person's, like that they can speak about that. It's like in our day-to-day experiences, and it's something that you may be so chronically exposed to that you're not necessarily aware of it, or you may not necessarily think about it in that way. So the manifestation of historical and collective trauma may manifest as other challenges that happen in the family. And that may be what's most salient to a young person. So I think they're definitely related as it relates to just historic and systemic racism. But the manifestations probably may not manifest in a way that connects, where youth are making connection between their ethnic identity, for example, and the trauma that they're experiencing in a day-to-day basis. The other side of that I sometimes am concerned about is assumptions that may be made. So assumptions that are made in the way that we racialize youth from particular groups, that they are dealing with trauma. So I think the other danger is that, in the same way, we don't want to assume that all youth of color see race or ethnicity as central to their, definitions of self. They may not all, sort of feel related to trauma, or they may not have all have experienced trauma in very direct ways. And so I think my concern sometimes is that educators will be so hypersensitive that they're just going to assume that all children of color in particular, must have trauma somewhere. So I think that there's some balance that we need to have.
And that seems like there's some parallels with that, all the risk of all adolescents or youth of color, that their racial and ethnic identity is important to them.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Yeah. That risk of like assuming that.
Yes. Yeah. And, it's hard to sometimes disentangle, because it's in the same way we used to, people still do this, I guess, but like youth of color would be labeled at risk automatically. And there certainly is, when we think about the context of racism, there's certainly levels in which we've institutionalized risk that, in the, ways we've segregated people and all those sorts of things. But when you talk to an individual young person, their actual, like from a phenomenological perspective, how they make meaning of themselves may not necessarily be through this, deficit risk kind of lens. And I think that's important to, not draw those conclusions based on these broad categories.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. Chris, I don't want to leave you out.
Oh no, I'm just listening. I'm cool with all that. So when I was hearing all the stuff you guys were talking about, I was thinking about like, yeah, we don't want, or yeah, some kids are trying not to be identified as this or that, but I see so much in the professional, or in like the more older you get, if you're doing something of benefit, and you're a person of color, you're labeled as like a Black doctor or a Native social worker or a Black this, Native that. How is that affecting kids who are trying to be that professional level, or Black people or indigenous people in general? How does that affect them when they're trying not to have that play a role in what they're trying to do professionally or in their life as a whole?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I'm not exactly sure in terms of the impact, but I speculate that it means different things to different people. And I think sometimes, I think what's important is recognizing that, you can be a doctor regardless of your racial or ethnic background. Historically, the way that we've, again, live in this racialized society, for some racial groups, we've made it a lot harder to, get the educational requirements and all of those things. But I don't think we need to go to the extreme of this is, the exceptional Black person who is now the doctor. And we are then going to tokenize that person and say, look, if they can become a Black doctor, you can, so I think that representation does matter, but I think, you represent that person if they are being recognized for excellence as a physician, for example, then they should be recognized for excellence as a physician. So I think that that's important, but I think the representation, so when you're recognizing excellent physicians, you want to make sure that you're looking at all of the, potential people and the opportunity. So I find it sometimes that balance between having some things that do connect you back to culture that are a source of pride, And so you really do want to name it from within the group versus out group members naming it for you. I think that that is where we need to kind of do a better job of striking a balance, because then it becomes, a bit of like tokenism. And for those young people who are like, well, I just, I don't really think too much about race. I just want to be a doctor. It may feel like you're pushing something down my throat that I'm not ready to receive right now.
Yeah, that's something that's very important. And when you were answering that question, I was also thinking about like someone who sees themselves as a Black or a Native person. You see yourself in these kind of stereotype stuff. Like what me and Virgil were talking about before you hopped on was just like the Res Kid's name, and as they're trying to change it. And as an Indigenous person, if that's all you see, that's going to have some type of effect on what you view your identity as.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know, you can talk a little bit about that and how important seeing
Yeah,
yourself
all
as
of
that
the
is.
like
Yeah.
media images and things like that. And because we're all exposed to those images. And so we carry them, we, the collective we, carry those. So when you meet an Indigenous person, it's sort of like, oh, here's the knowledge that I have. And I've never been told otherwise. And so the like frame that I have in my mind is related to these stereotypes and generalizations. And in research with kids, so young adolescents and older adolescents, a lot of them talk about maybe feeling a strong sense of racial or ethnic pride, but being really sort of very upfront about like, I don't want to be identified as a stereotype. Like I want to name my, racial ethnic label, and I want you to understand that it's important to me, but I also don't want to be identified with all of the stereotypes about my group. And so they are navigating through that as well. And those school-based examples I gave you from our interviews, I feel like we're not helping very much if in, social studies curricula, we're just talking about these historical, events through this very much like deficit, victimized kind of lens.
And I had a follow up to that. What are your thoughts, or what is the research saying about social media? And I know you mentioned the sort of national context and Markstrom's work in taking into that sort of the global context and national context. But just what do you think, or what would you have to say to those practitioners or those mentors around navigating the impact, both positive and negative, of social media?
Yeah. So the one example that comes to mind when you said that was the viral videos of murders of African Americans by the police, that young people can easily access. And there's some recent research looking at the negative impacts of being exposed to media violence through social media or other forms of media. um, and so we know that seeing those images can be really challenging for young people. So I think that the filters and supports that are around young people become really critical. So if you are a young person who's on your Twitter feed or whatever, and you watch this video, but you never get a chance to process it, then you're doing all of that processing alone internally. And that I think can take a toll. So that's where it's really critical that, adult family members or other caring adults are able to have supportive conversations around that. And for young people who've already been socialized with sort of a critical consciousness lens, the way they make meaning of those events may be different than a young person who doesn't have that same level of thinking, who may think, more about issues of like safety, and how their group is perceived versus like, I view this as an injustice that I can fight back against. So I think opportunities to develop agency and to really provide some critical lenses for young people to interpret that are important. But the first step is finding out what they've seen and what they're exposed to, so that they're not, just trying to make sense of it on their own.
And is this some of the work that the Center for Parent and Teen Communication that you're part of does? Like, I guess I'm wondering, how, because based on my sort of little research of what they do, it's a lot of media and stuff. So maybe just if you could talk a little bit about the Center for Parent and Teen Communication and how that maybe integrates with what you just talked about.
Sure. So far, they're not going down to that level, but that's what we hope to do. So Center for Parent Teen Communication, which if you're interested, you can go to parentandteen.com, is a web-based center. The staff are mostly based in Philadelphia, and it's resources for parents of adolescents. It takes very much a strengths-based view of adolescence. It's for parents and other adult caregivers on, how to have conversations with your teen, why things like lectures can backfire, for example. What do we understand about developing adolescents' brains and bodies and social and emotional development? So there's a bunch of great information on the website. We are now moving into a phase where all of that information is really helpful, but I think we all recognize, we as the staff, that it's not necessarily responsive to particular communities. So there isn't information about like, how do you have that conversation with your teen who's just watched, like a viral video of a police killing or something like that. So that's what we're moving into. So right now we're working to partner with organizations so that we can have conversations with families, parents of adolescents, and young people themselves on what does that look like in their household, what kinds of resources would be supportive in order to provide some scaffolding, all with the sense that young people have the capacity for compassion and caring and agency and all of those things. So I think we're moving into that kind of fine-grained level by identifying what communities actually say that they need. So what do parents feel like would be most useful to them?
Thank you. That makes sense. Check that out. It looks very exciting. They have a lot of wonderful people on their board or part that they're working with, such as Dr. Williams. I'm going to take, I see we have a little bit of time left, so I wanted to take some questions from the audience. Is that okay?
Yeah.
Okay, so I have one from Samantha Sweeney, and she says, how might I encourage schools to address race and racial identity more head on versus being silent? Do you have resources for advocacy around policy and creating change in the school setting? I will be an social work intern in the school setting for the next school year.
Oh, congratulations. That's very exciting. I will say there's a website that says I think it's called ethnicstudiesnow.com, which has specific resources on ethnic studies curricula. So I think curriculum is a starting place. And I think for some teachers, that is maybe a comfortable starting place. Like, you're giving me the resources that help me understand what I need to say. A website called Teaching Tolerance also has a lot of great resources that can be used in not just in social studies, but in other areas of curriculum as well. On the policy level, I think that's a bit challenging. I think part of it for the local school division is about really believing that this is important. So I mentioned Precious Knowledge as a documentary. Back about, I guess now 10 years or so ago, the Tucson School Board fought against the Raza Studies curriculum really hard and actually got it banned. So even though there was all this strong evidence that Mexican American studies was so valuable for young people, and not just Mexican heritage youth, but also other youth, they thought that it was like too much of, Mexican American culture, not enough Eurocentric history. And so they banned that whole curriculum. Since then, just a couple of years ago, that decision was overturned. But I think that taking the pulse of the local school division is important. Where I've been in Central Virginia, I've done a lot of work with local schools. Albemarle County Schools now has an anti-racism policy. So on the policy level, they've now developed, it was actually developed in part by some high school students from the school division who worked with one of my students to develop a school-wide policy on what it means to be an anti-racist school division. I will say there's a lot of room for growth in terms of curriculum, but they are like pushing towards some of this deeper work as well. So there are some good examples out there.
And I guess, because I found the University of the Youth Next whole sort of movement and conferences and the resources and all of that to be tremendously valuable in me starting to understand better, adolescent and positive youth development. And so I was wondering if you could maybe add to or talk a little bit about that and maybe the direction that the Youth Next is going and your work in that.
Sure. Yeah, thank you for asking. And that's a great plug for Youth Next. So I've been involved with the center since it developed about 10 years ago. The current director, Nancy Deutsch, is a good friend of mine, and she just became director a couple of years ago. Youth Next brings together scholars and policymakers, as well as educators and youth, to really think about promoting effective youth development. And so I had the privilege of hosting a conference called Youth of Color Matter back in 2015. And I think some of those resources are still available on the web. Our most recent conference was about sort of educating for democracy and social activism among youth. And so Youth Next, in partnership with another center, the Center for Race and Public Education in the South, which is also at UVA, has developed this Educating for Democracy curriculum, which are, again, curricular resources that bring together an emphasis on race and kind of democracy in the United States. And what's really nice is that they are developmentally appropriate. So there's resources that are for elementary school teachers and middle school and high school, depending on, there's different conversations that need to be had depending on the age of the child. So Youth Next has a lot of great resources on the website,
including videos of past conferences, and they have a lot of resources. It's well done.
Yeah.
So I see we're about at the top of the hour, 1 p.m. I'm wondering if you have any last thoughts, or before we get off. I want to personally thank both you and Chris, and Two Feathers, thank you for taking time, and hopefully we can continue some sort of collaboration relationship. So any last words or thoughts?
I think I want to end maybe on an optimistic note. Obviously, we are in the midst of some really deep conversations that we've needed to have for a long time. I don't want to be pessimistic, because I felt back in like 2015, 2016, like we were starting to move the needle a little bit, and then we just got stalled out. But I think with all of the social activism that we've seen happening across the country, I don't think we can turn back from the floodgates that have opened for people recognizing the existence of institutionalized racism and the ways that it affects people. I think the context of the pandemic has altered all of our lives, but has created an opportunity for so many people to pause and become more aware of this, other pandemic of racism that's been, much longer sort of present. So I think, to me, this creates where there is a need for policy change. For example, I think that we don't have to argue for why it's important anymore. And I think that creates potentially some more resources. So I would just encourage everybody in the audience to keep pushing towards all of the work, whether we're talking about the individual young persons developing ethnic or racial identity, or looking at policy and kind of institutionalized change. We need to sort of take this opportunity to push towards racial justice at all of these levels. So Virgil, thank you so much for the invitation. It was my pleasure. I look forward to working with you again. Chris, thank you for sharing your story and for your questions. And this has been a great pleasure for me.
Yes, well said, and what a strong finish. So thank you all for tuning in. We'll be back at it next week. We have 2 speakers, and that will be on Tuesday and Thursday, I believe. For everybody out there, have a wonderful weekend, and prayers, and for those that are struggling or in facing this very turbulent time. So Two Feathers is now out.
Bye, everyone.